Thank you, Vishaka, and thank all of you for joining us here at what is actually the second in the CGT's Reimagining Global series. This began with the question of the global as such. Here today, subtitled The Place of the University. A perfect subtitle, I must say, given to this panel by our own CGT chair, Vishaka Desai, who has so expertly guided this committee of colleagues in recent years. And so, you know, this really is a collaboration. And so by way of very brief introduction, I just want to begin with the official prompt that was circulated to our esteemed colleagues who have been so generous to join us here in a very busy time. So this is the prompt. As borders harden, economies contract, and authoritarian nationalisms rise, knowledge, recognizable as global, not for its universality, but for its relational character, faces an unprecedented challenge: how to reclaim the place of knowledge production or to reinvent its meaning at a time when globality in its various contradictory forms is experiencing a crisis on several fronts. Their own borders constantly shifting, their scale and scope expanding and contracting, universities worldwide have long been sites of encounter, imagination, and exchange, as Vishaka also emphasized. Even today, institutions with dramatically different histories and vastly unequal resources reproduce old tensions between the cultivation of citizens, the training of technologists, and the production of new knowledge. Still, to many, both liberal education and specialized research seem at risk of bending, if not breaking, under the pressures of a global market, even as scholars, teachers, and students respond with practical urgency to today's intersecting and, we must say, carbon-saturated crises. New institutions form while others struggle. Elites consolidate while inequality proliferates. In what ways, then, might we still speak of something like, if we could ever, speak of something like a global university, and in what ways must we reorient our thought, perhaps to acknowledge its limits, but also to reimagine new possibilities? To this, I just only want very, very briefly to add more intimate reminders of globality, like, for example, the QR codes you may have seen calling urgently for help that went up around the campus here almost immediately after news broke of the earthquake in Syria and Turkey, the incalculable tragedy of which is compounded by the fact that the death toll of 7,000 listed on those posters now seems hopelessly and helplessly anachronistic. The real-time recorded there reminds us that the place of the university in the global order is based usually on delay. Standing back, watching history unfold, that's kind of our, disposition. Universities have never been especially good at rapid response. Classically, at least, our campuses have been better suited as places to think untimely thoughts, which means maybe more often than not, thoughts that take time, including thoughts in this case, about the history and meaning of the term global itself. And yet, as we gather here in the aptly named World Room on Columbia's campus in Upper Manhattan, which, by the way, remains on Lenape land, mounting crises call us, it seems, out of our libraries and our laboratories, even perhaps out of our extension stations, fields, and fieldwork, and into the world. To some extent, then, a university is, to misuse an expression from the physics department, a space-time singularity, a kind of generative interruption in the fabric of everyday life. But it's also a bridge. On the one hand, and despite this room's august name, the place of universities is otherworldly. On the other hand, we who care for that place may well feel ourselves caught in something like history's anteroom, a kind of eternal airport lounge, unsure whether we're coming or going, kind of fundamental disorientation. Such a place might best be described as somewhere in between, a passage in time. After all, what is a university? And not only a modern one, and not only in the West or in the North, but a place of gates and rites of passage, which today range from admissions to graduation to peer review. The global crises, however, that seem to collapse all time into real time, seem also to throw these gates open, inviting us, requiring us perhaps, to abandon our anachronistic habits and get straight to work. Think of a university then as a provisional and quite uneven solution to a boundary problem, a way of distinguishing and linking the world in here, in the world room, for example, from and to the world out there, so that each can inform and affect the other. This work of differentiating, classifying, and connecting takes time, which is why we daily find ourselves beset by things like course schedules, calendar invites, and grant deadlines, all of which, along with the labor that these both measure and efface, help to produce, organize, and circulate our knowledge on lists like syllabi or library catalogs, in databases made of numbers and narratives, and in words, images, charts, equations, prototypes, code, and so on. But if all of this sounds a bit abstract, I remind you that each of the panelists here who have graciously agreed to share their time with us this evening, one of whom has even brought her class, rescheduled class, brought her class, so welcome, each has been given exactly more or less 3 minutes, so, you know, schedules, to do so, to share their thoughts at the outset. This is going to range across the table, probably. It's going to vary, which I'm sure, therefore, you'll be happy to allow extended at least to 5. After which, in the time remaining, we will converse less formally, followed punctually by questions from you, our audience, such that the 90 minutes we have been allotted together will hopefully seem not nearly enough. So with that all in mind, and the sense of momentum that maybe we can build, I just will very briefly introduce a group of people who in this world in particular don't need really much of an introduction, if at all. And so I'll keep these intros quite formal and brief. And we'll just go down, I'll introduce down the table in the order that we'll proceed. So first is Wafa El-Sadr, and MD, MPH, MPA, who's Executive Vice President of Columbia Global, and the Dr. Matilda Krim Amfar, Chair of Global Health at Columbia University, founder and director of Global Health Center, ICAP at Columbia, University Professor in Epidemiology and Medicine, and an expert in global health and infectious diseases. Dr. El-Sadr has led large-scale innovative projects worldwide, like truly worldwide, with decisive impacts on HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, antimicrobial resistance, and most recently, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Following Wafa is Samuel Sia is Professor of Biomedical Engineering and Vice Provost for Fourth Purpose and Strategic Impact here at Columbia. Professor Sia's work focuses on microfluidics and miniaturized wearable and implantable medical devices, such as rapid low-cost test to identify HIV and other infectious diseases. He also co-founded Harlem Biospace, a biotech incubator launched in partnership with the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Following Sam will be Carol Gluck, who is the George Sansom Professor of History Emerita, specializing in the history of modern Japan, international history, and public memory. And of her numerous books, I will only highlight 2, Thinking with the Past, the Japanese and Modern History, and then in a sense as a kind of companion, the forthcoming Past Obsessions, World War II in History and Memory. And of special importance for us here today is the fact that Carol is a founding member and Chair Emerita of the Committee on Global Thought. After Carol will be Miguel Urquiola, who is the Dean of Social Science and Professor of Economics and of International public affairs, again, here at Columbia. Dean Urquiola's research is on the economics of education. His focus is on understanding how schools and universities compete and how educational markets differ from other markets that economists study. He's written numerous journal articles on these issues, and in particular, I highlight a book on why American universities excel at research, markets, minds, and money. And then finally, Rosalind Morris, who is an anthropologist, a cultural theorist, documentarian, professor of anthropology at Columbia University, and CGT member. Her recent work grows out of extensive field research in Southern Africa on the histories of mineral extraction, particularly in gold, and addresses itself to theoretical debates in political theory, economic anthropology, literary criticism, and media studies. Related recent books include a collaboration with the artist William Kentridge and a book-length essay on the Enlightenment concept of fetishism and 20th century theory, and the extraordinary documentary film, We Are Zama Zama, which is currently playing on BBC Africa. So with that, I will withdraw and hand over the table to our colleagues, and we'll just go down.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here and honor to be with my very esteemed colleagues. I think in thinking about the topic of tonight's discussion, I recall a talk that was given actually many years ago, more than 100 years ago, by President Seth Low. And he's the namesake for Low Library, this way, right? Down this way. And this was upon his installation as the president of Columbia College in February, this month, of 1890. So I really have remained, I was very struck by his words, and I think they're relevant to this conversation today, believe it or not. So at that point, President Low spoke of Columbia then, and what Columbia could learn from New York City. And in turn, Columbia's responsibility to the city which surrounds it. And he urged then the assembled students and professors in the room to engage with the city, to gain inspiration. But also, most importantly, he urged them to give back in return. So that was more than 100 years ago. He also said a couple of things, and I quote. He said, quote, "There's no such thing as the world of letters, apart from the world of men, and I would say of women." And he added, this is another quote, that the scholar without the vision is a pedant. He mistakes learning for an end in and of itself, instead of seeing that is only a weapon in a wise man's hands. So these are the words that were articulated way back regarding what the university is all about, or what Columbia should be all about. He was focusing on Columbia, urging then the students and the faculty to give and to take from the communities that surround the university. But this was in 1890, and that was, like I said, a long time ago. And is this vision relevant today? And I think it's even more relevant today. And especially, I think, in this world today that's so interconnected, as we heard before, with so many complex challenges, we must really recommit in terms of how do we achieve this vision of a university that completely engaged with the world, both locally and globally. And I think in many ways we're fortunate, because this vision that was first articulated so long ago has been, of course, articulated by Lee Bollinger, our current president. And his firm conviction, as you know, is that universities today must break the walls around them, and that both literally and figuratively. And this is motivated by, I think, Lee's deep belief that we have so much to learn from the world, but also so much to give to the world. And so it's a combination, this bi-directional idea of learning, giving, learning as well as giving. So let me tell you then kind of where this sits and from where I'm at now. And I'll tell you a bit about, which will offer you some, again, build on this, on these thoughts. And I can introduce Columbia Global and the genesis of Columbia Global, this entity, new entity established at the university that I'm honored to lead, and how it builds on these on the momentum of what's been going on for many years and the conversation that's been going on many years. And just to let you know that Columbia Global is a new entity established at the university, and it builds on the momentum of three of inaugural organizations that are part and parcel at this point of Columbia Global. That's Columbia World Projects, the Global Center Network, as well as the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. And I think in many ways, the mission of Columbia Global is to think differently and do differently. It's both to think differently and act differently. And it's to really to foster a culture of creativity, innovation, imagination, entrepreneurship, interdisciplinary collaborations, and also creative partnerships. And you ask yourself to what aim, and I think the goal is to really take the scholarly outputs of our amazing faculty at Columbia to the next step. And what do I mean by the next step? Is to propel their scholarship and to inform scholarly discourse that is relevant to the issues that we face today, the big societal challenges, as well as hopefully that the scholarship will help inform policies and also guide actions to address these challenges. And to be very concrete, I'll give you an example, like for example, at the Columbia World Projects, which is one of the initiatives under Columbia Global umbrella. And we call it the home of the fourth purpose. And many of you may not be aware of the fourth purpose. The fourth purpose is really Lee Bollinger's idea as an important component of the university's mission, and it builds on the traditional three purposes of the university, which are 1, education, 2, research, and 3, service. So, for example, I think what we try to do is to engage with the individuals, the faculty who are engaged with CWP in the convenings of research or projects, and to have them appreciate the value of a few things, the value of working across disciplines in order to address complex problems, a realization that complex issues today cannot be solved by one discipline. They require us working differently across disciplines, and also cannot be solved just by universities. We have to be humble, and that these essentially large problems, whatever they may be, they require partnerships between the universities, but also external players, whether they be other universities or corporate sector or whatever it might be, or community organizations. We have to go beyond our traditional partners. And very importantly, obviously, in what we do is the concept of engaging communities from day one in a manner in which we can co-create the generation of the knowledge and co-create the solutions. So I think ultimately, we need to recognize that we need to revisit as a university, not just what we do, which is very important. I'm sure my colleagues will talk about that as well, but also how we do it. We very often focus on the what, and we don't as much think about the how we do what we want to do. And I feel like the how is very, very important. And that's at the essence, I think, of this kind of new engagement, this kind of new thinking is the how. It's not just the what, but the how. And I think also we must acknowledge and be humble and realize that, as I say, what got us here won't get us there. And that's the title of a book that somebody wrote that I often quote. So what got us here won't get us there. So we have to be humble and realize that we need to change and we need to evolve and adapt. So I guess finally, the role of universities in today's global conditions is I think more crucial than ever. But it also is a new role. It has to change and be modified and adapted to be able to meet the challenges of today by focusing on the how and the what, and also by appreciating that we need to do things differently. So I think we need to recognize what made our university global in the past is not enough, and it won't maintain our, I don't know whether the right word is globalness or globality. Use the term globality. I like that better than globalness in the future. How can we maintain this in the future? And ultimately, I think we start by by really re-examining the values as well as the structures that shape the production of knowledge, but also that shape the dissemination of knowledge, both the values as well as the structures. And we need to really think about and reimagine, I think, alternative forms of knowledge generation, knowledge dissemination as we move forward. So that's it for now. And I want to thank you again. And I hope this can inform some of the conversations and the discussions after the presentations from my colleagues. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to Vishaka and Reinhold for the kind invitation to be here on this really important discussion, and obviously with this distinguished panel. I wanted to just make a couple points, maybe talking about the fourth purpose and actually echoing some of what Wafa was saying in terms of how we're thinking about this from the Provost's office. But maybe before that, just a quick, personal anecdote. In my experience working on global issues, I came here in 2005 as an assistant professor in engineering, making these miniaturized devices, and was kind enough to actually work with Wafa, who was very welcoming to me, to bring them to Rwanda and test them there. And we actually published some nice papers together, but I certainly felt very humbled by that experience in realizing how difficult it is to achieve real impact. We have a great technology, how to bring it to the benefit of humanity. It's tough. I mean, Wafa has had more a lot more real world success than that project that we did, but it really, I think, goes into the heart of this challenge of what we're calling, and what Lee Bollinger termed the fourth purpose. How many of you have heard of the fourth purpose before Wafa gave that introduction? Okay, that's great. Not everyone, but a number of you. And there's probably different ways of formulating this, but I think we're all in agreement that it's about translating knowledge into action that can make a positive impact on humanity. And if we are to do that in a university setting, we would probably have to partner with entities outside of the academy to make real world impact. We're not going to do that just sitting here alone. And so that's maybe in a nutshell what's termed the fourth purpose. And it's difficult. I mean, it's something I think we almost need to do. It's a really timely point in right now to in light of all the challenges in the world to reimagine what the role of a university, not just Columbia, but the role of higher education in engaging with the pressing challenges of today. That's important for not only us at a university to stay relevant and also not be seen as elitist by some, but it's also actually important for the world as well to have our intellectual engagement and not being stepping back from playing a role and letting others do that work. But again, it's a little bit easier said than done. And I think this is where, when Wafa was saying it's not about just the what, it's about the how. It's a little bit more nuanced and probably a little bit more challenging and actually more exciting as a result to think about how we should do this in higher ed. And I won't go into all of the issues here, but I'll just bring up maybe a couple issues. One is really balancing how we work on basic scholarship and discovering knowledge with this active commitment to engaging with the world's problems. And I think if we are to be successful in that, we have to do both. The university has always been a place where we have pushed the boundaries on learning and discovering new ideas. Someone has to do that in society, and the university has been a robust institution for doing that. And I don't think we can abandon basic scholarship at all. But how do we do that, but at the same time have this engagement with these issues in the world? And really, those two things shouldn't be at odds with each other. If this is done well, there's a constant dialogue between generating new ideas and implementing them in practice, and they actually can feed forward to each other. Not everybody has to be doing this, but there is a way to do this really well. And so I think that's one thing we want to be very cognizant of. There's 17 schools here at Columbia. Most, if not all of them, actually have faculty. I think all of them have faculty engaging in what we're calling fourth purpose in some form or another, but it's in very different ways. It could be bringing a product to market in the more science and engineering fields. It could be working with a community partner, maybe right here at home, to implement some practice in our neighboring communities right around Columbia. And it could be doing things in the global stage as well, working with governments and nonprofits. And so how to do that, but while still preserving the basic scholarship and in fact having them feed off each other is one issue. The other one, which I'll talk about, that is more of a personal take, I think, than anything, is I think it's very important for us to try to help be as inclusive as possible in our views of how we actually bring about changes in the world. So again, it's the how and not just the what. And I think we need to find ways to not only talk to half the population in this country or those who agree with us, and we have to sort of stay true to the original, in a way, or a traditional role of a university to be a place where we're inclusive of different viewpoints and different ideas, because that is the way we actually not only get to maybe get closer to the truth, but actually also get to the hearts of a lot of people. And that usually a lot of times is actually the impediment, is not the intellectual part. So that is something I think we can do at Columbia, being the global university that we are. And as I think the next president has said in her opening, some of her opening remarks, one of the challenges that we're facing today is to try to find a way to be both scholarly and relevant. And we want to do both. And I can go into other issues in terms of the nitty-gritty of things we're thinking about, how to support our schools and institutes and centers at Columbia to work on fourth purpose. But I'll probably stop there, but also just point out, when we're talking about pressing challenges, we really have an opportunity to do something really special at Columbia. There are very few institutions in the world that have the breadth of expertise that we have, and every single crisis or challenge that comes up, we literally have the best scholars and practitioners in the world, whether it's COVID or the Ukraine situation and just all sorts of things, that anything that comes up. And so I think we do have a role and obligation to actually play a role here, but how to balance that with other important commitments of the university as well. So I'll stop there.
Well, because my colleagues have identified themselves with a part of the university, I might as well do the same. I speak as a true believer in the Committee on Global Thought. That puts me actually in the realm of the first three, that is to say, teaching, research, and service. I'm happy with my three purposes. I am most interested in how we know, how we learn, what we know, what we learn. I will make 3 points about this from that point of view. First of all, I, for one, do not believe that the global is in crisis. I think the globe is in crisis, and that's something different. And what we really need to do is figure out how to deal with our globally relational, interconnected, interdependent world. So, I mean, I think it's, I'm not the crises, I think, are not in the nature of our global connections. Number two, I study Asia, and I always think of the metaphor that's used often as the view of the frog in the bottom of the well. The frog in the bottom of the well only sees his or her section of the sky, which suggests that it's a very limited perspective. But the other thing about the frog in the bottom of the well is the frog doesn't know that he or she is in the well. All right, and that's equally important. So when we talk about global knowledge of something outside that narrow perspective, we don't only mean the world out there. Global is not something, I just wrote about this the other day, about how when in the United States, when textbooks talk about America in the world, they talk about America and the world, as if America is not in the world. So the global is not something that's only out there in some other region. It's not a place. It's all these connections and things we're talking about. And it's in this country, not because there are people from other places here, but because we have in Alabama, we can find things that relate, that are based on relationally and everywhere else to the global. So to me, this is a matter of a larger perspective. And what, for me, thinking globally means, Committee on Global Thought, for our students and our research and our research, it has to do with knowing and being and acting in the world. But it's not acting in the world in this direct fourth purpose, Columbia World Projects way. Our role, I mean, I'm a historian and a teacher, is to work with, in conversation with and dialogue with students so that we feel the responsibility. We know that about the world that we're in and that's in us, according to Seth Lowe. He's very smart, right? To say that for him, the city really was the world for him. And it was true then, to sort of animate the way we understand things so that we will act in the world. This is a matter of, to be blunt, education, learning and teaching. So, and thinking differently. So I believe that I'm a believer in what I always call learning about things and people and crises in global context. But I'm not someone who, I no longer use the word, the global university. And the reason I don't use it anymore is because I've had enough with European and Asian universities, for which, in which places global university means where you rank in the global rankings of the universities, you know, is MIT above the University of Cambridge, et cetera, and where is Columbia? Or it means number two, international students. This is what a lot of the global university initiatives are around the world, bringing more global international students. And the third thing it means is establishing these subjects and fields and departments of global studies, which is basically a ghetto for people who think about anything else but us. So, I mean, the frogs are still in their bottoms of their well all over the university, and then there's somebody who's supposed to see the sky. Doesn't work. So I don't use the word the global university. I do like Columbia Global, because I do think that it gives us enough play in that to include the fourth purpose and the partnerships in the so-called real world. But I come down very hard on the basic task of the university. And I want us to think differently, not only about the world in here and out there, but about the systemic blinders on our own knowledge and values. We don't see them. We talk about systemic racism that we don't see. Well, we don't see our own world. We really don't. I mean, it's one of the things that it's a human phenomenon. You look back at something, a historian, you look back 50, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and you say, how could they not have seen that? Well, there are a lot of things we don't see right now. And this kind of thinking, this what I call global thinking, and you can see that I'm using the word global metaphorically, not just in terms of the map up there. I'm using it in a way that suggests that we have to think differently. And some of the thinking and teaching differently has to do with what we call making and doing, so that the how, when we teach, rather than just, you know, lecturing at and knowledge, that in actually making things and doing things, this is in a way action, and it is a kind of proto, or if you like, a form that immediately leads, when we do it, students to want to act in the world and to think they can do it. So for me, it's about global thinking, it's about education, and it's about, let's say, getting as many frogs out of their wells, demolishing as many wells as possible, but doing it in a creative way. In other words, thinking globally. So for me, that's a very, if you like, a very positive, celebratory view. That is my view. And I do believe that the Committee on Global Thought, which is going to be part of Columbia Global, it's going to come under your umbrella, that's our job. It's teaching and researching and speaking out and being, as I said before, thinking, being, and acting in the world. That's my definition. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. So Carol is an eminent historian. I'm not a historian, but I've read a fair bit of the history of universities. And I think that one thing that we can see right away is that it's a very successful type of institution as a type. So, universities have existed for, roughly maybe like 800 years. And one thing that has been true is that from the very beginning, they were global in the sense that they looked beyond just particularly the good ones. For example, one of the original ones, the University of Paris, one can say was more global than many of our, so-called global universities. It really was training people from all over Europe, using what was then, a uniform language, a lingua franca, basically using Latin. So global, global nature has always been there. I don't think that we're seeing anything new or, things change. Now, basically, surviving is difficult, right? Because all institutions come under stress, and the university has been very successful to survive. It has gone through several, centuries of change, but also thoughts that technological change could do it in. So people thought, for example, that when the printing press came out, maybe universities would cease to exist, because why do you need a university when you can read everything cheaply? Not so long ago, when the so-called online courses came around, many people predicted that the university would disappear. So I think that as a type, it has proven to be incredibly resilient and incredibly successful. Now, one question that concerns us here is the type of institution, but also a particular institution, which is Columbia. And so universities compete globally, right? And there are rankings. There's a competition that's national, that is global. And what is less obvious is that every single school, which school will be the most successful is sort of an open question. Now, when any institutional, either type or particular or individual institution faces technical change or sort of competition, you have to think about, how am I going to survive and how am I going to be successful? And I'm an economist by training. I'll give you the standard answer that an economist would do there. You basically say, what is my comparative advantage? What is a comparative advantage? Is what am I relatively good at? And I should focus on what I'm relatively good at, and then, basically do that and sort of see, then let the chips fall where they may. That will be my best strategy. Now, in the U.S., universities are more recent, although they're more than 350 years old as a type. And so, what are our comparative advantages here? And here, I think I come to Carol's points. I think that it's quite clear that we have comparative advantages in two areas. One, we've been pretty good at training, right? So we basically teach well. We've become selective. The best universities have basically become selective. And this seems to be one way in which we really have a huge impact on the world, which is to train students and send the students out. And I think, if we think of the two main things that a university does, there's teaching and there's research. They both have huge impact. So one of our core activities is basically teaching. The other one is research. And, we've also developed here in the US, particularly since the time of roughly Seth Low here in New York City, and roughly since the time of Seth Low in all of the US, basically, up to that time, US universities were not very active in research at all. Actually, they were already active in teaching, but not at research at all. And then they basically became very successful at this, and arguably the best in the world, I would say. And so this is the second thing we have become very good at. Now, when we look forward and we say, how can we exploit our comparative advantages, both to do good for the world and both to survive as an institution, as a specific institution, and lead. So 20 or 30 years after Seth Low, if you had asked many people, maybe 30, 40 years, which are the leading universities in the US, basically Columbia would have come out at number 1 or number 2, I think, basically at that point. Less obvious that that's the case now, but we have to basically focus on saying, how can we keep that going, right? And how do we keep the whole institutional type going? There, let me close by saying that I think we have to be cognizant of basically saying, how do we measure what we're doing? How do we recruit people who are good at our core activities? How do we incentivize them to be good? And then how do we evaluate them and see that they are good? And so we basically have developed, since Seth Low, a whole infrastructure that says, I can find a good historian. I can give him or her incentives to, find them when they're young, give them good incentives to do research, and then kind of know when they've done good research. And this is crucial. What I see a little bit in the fourth purpose, and let me come back to the other presentations, is a bet that there's some new comparative advantage that we could develop. It's an interesting bet. It's an interesting bet. However, I think that the proof that we have the tools of talent identification, of incentivization, of basically measurement remains to be seen. I will almost stop there. Let me close by saying that there are many industries where basically competition is very unforgiving. I like to tell students that if you're in the restaurant industry in New York City and you stop paying attention to what you're good at, you'll be out of business within 6 months. If you are cooking and you stop cooking well, the market will take care of you very quickly. In universities, given how they've developed, particularly elite universities, that's not the case. We can do things not quite right and survive many decades, centuries even. And so this gives the leadership of the university and the faculty of the university a special responsibility. We have to be especially thoughtful and especially careful because the market won't discipline us very quickly. If we make mistakes, we'll be dead before the institution actually pays for them dearly. But that just raises the challenge, I think. And so let me close by saying we are in a global university. Universities have always been global. In that, I don't see much new. They've always competed. They've always tried to impact the world. They've been very successful at that. And the question for us is how do we maximize Columbia's impact and Columbia's welfare, since we are a little bit selfish and like the institution in which we live in that regard. Let me stop there and pass it to Ross.
Thank you, Reinhold. Thank you, Avishika, for the invitation to join the panel. This is the pure demonstration of the conflict of the faculties.
Yeah.
I think this is one of those beautiful moments where each of us speaks so explicitly from the disciplinary and institutional locus in which we live and work. And the question is, if we were Kantians or even post-Kantians or Humboldtians, we would ask ourselves, what is the concept that will allow for these faculties to coexist in the same institution in a manner that makes its work? And the question is whether we have such a concept. What would the coherence of this difference consist in? How would we work together to preserve the goods of the university that we know are available to us, and mitigate the problems that are not going to kill us fast enough, as Mika would say. I have 5 points. Carol will say you should have 3, but you will hear in my speech some resonance with Carol's approach, and there's a reason for that. I sit in the humanities and the humanistic social sciences, and that, of course, inflects what I'll say. My day started this morning with a WhatsApp from a young Chitonga-speaking Zimbabwean informal miner with whom I work in South Africa. During my day of advising, I had conversations with a German student of mine who is working in Kazakhstan on migrant labor, with another student who is writing her thesis on Dalit caregivers in casteist institutions in India. It included a conversation with a young cellist who's in my class on extractionism and the anthropology thereof. And you might say, well, that is evidence of the global university. And I would say there's no such thing as a global university, contrary to my esteemed colleague and my dean. But there is a way in which the university, in the forms in which we inhabit it, can enable response to globality. And in this way, I would borrow, and I cite here my colleague Gayatri Spivak, who distinguishes between globality as that which is operative in the domains of economics and digitality or digitized spaces, And something else that she calls planetarity, the condition of the earth that we all inhabit that precedes this condition of globality, that will be there after it, and that we hope we will be with for some time to come, but that's of course in question. I want to now switch to consider a couple of things. I have lived and worked in 4 countries, Canada, the United States, Thailand, and South Africa. And in each of those places, very different kinds of places, we could describe 2 as settler colonies, we could describe the other as a absolute monarchy somehow melded together with a liberal democracy. We can speak about them in very many ways, but in these 4 very different nations, from welfare statism to absolute monarchy, in the course of the 20th century, the idea of universal education acquired, of its virtue, its capacity to change the world, acquired an enormous power and by and large became hegemonic in each of those very different places. That meant that people believed, one could say it succeeded, the idea of universal education succeeded. And one could immediately follow that statement by saying it succeeded in excess. And by this, I mean to say that people came to believe that education would change their lives. There was a slippage at some point. This slippage is what we inhabit. The notion that education will change our individual lives and that it will change the world. These are not the same things. And already early in the 20th century, Sigrid Krakow wrote about this, the substitution of the credentials for education itself ensured that that education will change our lives became getting a degree will get me a job. This is not the task of education in my mind, but it is something that we want to happen. And this brings me to that question of that 4th purpose with which I have had some vexed reflections, let's say. When we speak about, as we do speak about, and we should speak about, teaching, research, and service. I'm very much in the thinking about service these days for reasons we don't need to get into, but in any case, teaching, research, and service, these are domains of activity. I don't know that I would call them purposes. They are domains of activity in which we are judged, those of us who are faculty members. They are the sites where the metrics of our success or failure are applied. In my imagination, the doing good, which is what I hear, is some deep part of what is the 4th purpose, doing good in the world, engaging the world, is immanent to each of those 3 domains of activity. It is already inscribed in and defines the most fundamental elements of all pedagogy, which is basically the task of making people be different than what they were when you started with them. That kind of change, changing the way people think, changing the way they desire, changing what they want, learning to want less, learning to be different in relationship to the earth, that is a task of education. The research that we all do enables us to change our thinking about everything. In the sciences, in the bench sciences, in the lab sciences, in the humanities, whether you're a medievalist or you're a scholar of contemporary mineral extractivism, we are in the business of learning to think differently, to become other than what we were. In the realm of service, we are hoping to participate in the collective projects, larger and smaller, that we are all part of, that traverse the entire university. And that too is about changing the conditions within which we work. So I would see that as that kind of engagement, as I said, immanent to all the domains of our practice. But nonetheless, I hear and I recognize that there is a distinct ambition that is expressed when people invoke the notion of the 4th purpose. And this distinct ambition only makes sense when one is thinking about our university now in a time in which academic autonomy has somehow become, for many of us, appears to us to be something like ivory tower syndrome. Yeah, academic autonomy is the principle of the university that the old Humboldtian model attempted to preserve, imagining externally legitimated structures that could grant universities that kind of autonomy that would secure it against the ideological forces of the dominant in whatever societies they were in. We should not relinquish that. We need that now more than ever. That academic autonomy, that capacity to pursue thought, that capacity to resist the demands of the dominant, that capacity to argue with the economization of everything. But of course, if that is indeed simply the enclosure of the scholarly community and the students in the ivory tower, then it's of course a failure. But we are seeing at this moment, I'm going to close now because I always talk too long, and my 5 points turn into 10 or whatever. But we are seeing, I think, a new iteration of the kind of crisis we saw in the 70s, where after that incredible boom in the universities between the immediate post-war period and then the recessionary 1970s, which of course was also shaped so much by the social movements of the time, we are again in a recessionary period in which the former expansion now seems to be threatened by, on the one hand, the so-called shrinkage of the job market, and on the other hand, the loss of funding in certain areas. That's especially clear in the areas in which I work. There's lots of evidence to suggest that the job market hasn't shrunk, but it has changed. Not so much fewer jobs as casualized jobs. In fact, the president of the MLA published a very important article recently, really mapping that out in a fairly persuasive way. Not fewer jobs, but different kinds of jobs. And we know that people now pursue many kinds of jobs, and we know that what they want most is stability and security. So these are things that we need to address within our world. And I trust to the scholarly ambitions, the personal ambitions of our students and colleagues to be engaging those parts of the world where they can learn and make their contributions. But nobody lives in the global. They all live in particular places, and these are where these interventions have to make. I'll stop now, and I hope we can talk about all of these things in some other way.
All right, very good. But where to go from here? So, well, okay, I wouldn't just as on a sort of bookend, I can't resist the conflict of the faculties as a prompt to in a sense, not to dramatize what might be, some differences that matter and some distinctions that make a difference, and others, that are somewhat more modulated. But the well, I was going to say, okay, so what do you think? Okay, because in the model that Roz is referring to, it's a structural relation of higher and lower, where there are some forms of knowledge that are closer to power and to the sovereign. In those days, it was really like theology. And so that's in a sense, and then there's like philosophy, which was down below. So what do you think? Is that where we are? Is it?
I'm not sure there's a conflict. I mean, maybe it's maybe that's an issue to discuss. I mean, I am not. I mean, I do think that both what Carol said and maybe what you said, Rosin, as well, suggested that there was kind of a conflict. And so I would be considered a person who comes from the doing world, right? But in order to do, you have to also think. It's kind of, I think maybe there's been this false dichotomy that's been created of, I don't know, maybe the false dichotomy is at the university is between the humanities and the social sciences versus, I don't know, the professional schools or something. I mean, I feel like maybe that is kind of a false dichotomy and we're maybe part of what I was trying to say is that we really need to break, some of those dichotomies. I am confident. I feel confident that in your work, Rosin, in your work, Carol and Miguel as well, is that you do bridge those kinds of disciplinary barriers. I'm just not. I guess my sense is I think part of it is that I value and valuing both the generation of knowledge is very important. And I think the generation, rather than think of it as a discipline, or, you know, the kind of the importance of one area of education. It's more of the, how do we generate, not, what I was pushing is how do we generate knowledge? Can we think differently about generating knowledge? That's what I was getting at. Not that we shouldn't generate knowledge. Do you see? That's the.
I don't think there's, sorry, my
Yeah.
thing isn't working.
Oh,
I don't think
sorry.
there's a conflict here. What I do hear us saying, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Committee on Global Thought is committed to interdisciplinarity and pan-university. That isn't the issue. I think what you're hearing is simply, at least from my part and maybe Roz's part, just a way of making sure that we keep our eye on both balls. In other words, that the generation of knowledge and the transmission of the learning activity, it's an activity or domain you talked about, that we don't, as we pursue what's called the fourth purpose, we don't forget the others. That's all I think we
Yeah.
were saying. I don't believe that there's a conflict here, but I think at least that's what I was saying. I was saying one of teaching and learning and research is critically important for
Absolutely.
large parts of the
Yeah.
university, including for you. So I don't think it's a conflict. I don't think that's what's going on. I just think it's a question of making sure that we keep, if you like,
We'll
both
keep
balls in
both
the
of
air, to
them.
change the
Mhm.
ball metaphor. And I wanted to just have a word for that. And let me just echo what Roz said. I do think that research and learning does change you as an individual. I mean, if you talk to, I mean, you get a lot of students here. I don't think you're the same as you were when you walked through those gates into what you describe as another world. Oof. I don't see this as another world, but that may be because I live across the street, it's my world. But when you walked into the gates at Columbia, and now I don't think you feel like you're the same person. I mean, I'm not going to, put you on the spot and say, how are you different? But I do think that this is the part of the university that I hear you talking about and that I was talking
I think
about.
maybe one thought I have is I hear it from young people, students, is should we be thinking about how knowledge generation happens? Not that knowledge generation is not extremely important, obviously, at the foundation of universities. And how can we make the knowledge generation be more inclusive, maybe more
Thinking differently. What you're all saying is thinking differently. Isn't
But
that what
it's-
you're saying?
but well, I guess my sense is it has to be more than just about the individual thinking differently. What we ultimately want, and I feel like this, like in the COVID pandemic, where I was very involved in that, as you all know, we all lamented the fact that people thought about themselves, and there was not the thinking of the collective. There wasn't the thinking of kind of what happens in your community, what's happening. And I feel like we can, certainly education and training changes people, but we wanted to change, not just to change them as individuals, but change them as actors within a community, within a society, within a world. That's what I was trying to say.
Absolutely.
Okay, I just want to add, I meant I shouldn't have done this in such a flip way on a very quick schema. I mean, I was just quoting the title of Kant's book, Conflict of the Faculties, in which he was describing what happens when you have, on the one hand, these things like science, theology, and so forth, different faculties, then professional schools and so forth. And out of that, he had a notion that, there was a very upper faculty, and that upper faculty was the one that produced the teachers. Hence the Doctor of Philosophy being this very important degree, and the one place where the university says, this is what binds us together. We teach teachers. We teach generations to learn differently. So it was too fast in this context. So, but because what the faculty see, here's theology, here's medicine, here's later, of course, we would change this kind of science. And then in the sort of 20th century, of course, the whole phenomenon of the specialization, in particular in the sciences, which made it so complex to imagine, how does one acquire the requisite knowledge to participate usefully there and work in that domain and do those old-fashioned things of having a kind of universal education, a liberal arts grounding and so forth. And that's still with us, I mean, how much does our core take up? how much room is left for all of these other things. So when I said this is the conflict of the faculties, and we've got from medicine to economics, to history, and some of these, and anthropology wasn't in the picture then, but history certainly was. And of course, theology was very powerfully there for him. But in that what arose out of that was that question of like, so what does bind that? After one gave up the idea that there was a theological purpose, was there an idea that could constitute the animating vitality of the institution? And for a lot of, Karl Jaspers and people like Habermas, they argued that it was either the idea of, producing the good, or communicative practice or something like that would be what would hold it together. And increasingly, I think Habermas, he offered communicative practice as a solution against what they perceived as increasingly, there was nothing inside the university to hold everyone together. There was no shared set of ideas. And the more globalized the student population is, the less sharedness there is of those ideas. And also the more diverse the faculty population is, the less sharedness there is. Specialization of disciplines, all that. So what is it that's going to hold that together? And the lament of that particular radical tradition was that the only thing that people can use to hold it together is the external market. That this is what it wants, this is what it does, and that's, I think you're arguing that that's a thing that can do its work. This is, I hear the argument for the fourth purpose as an effort to respond to this crisis. What is it that will hold us all together? I don't know whether you feel that that's what it's doing, or whether it's just hold us together or not. It's a kind of moral task. That's what I meant to be pointing to.
We're definitely in philosophy seminar at this point, but so no, it's I'd love to continue, but so Miguel and Sam also probably have some thoughts on this.
Sure, I can add something. I mean, I think that I don't view it as a conflict. I do think that it's important to notice that sometimes impact and comes in different ways. Let me give a quick example of two economists, different people. So this morning I saw a young economist presenting at Teachers College, who's trying to basically design better ways for educational services to basically be delivered in India. Okay, and he's running experiments and stuff. This would be exactly like fourth purpose. And I say, great, fine. This is the research that this person wants to do. Phenomenal. This is give them autonomy. A different economist I'd like to cite is Ben Bernanke, who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. Or he, for a long time, was by himself studying the Great Depression. Kind of a weird thing, you're by yourself. And he should be given time to study the Great Depression. He saved more money for everyone in this room when the 2008 financial crisis came. He saved more suffering than lots of people. There was impact generated there that comes from the social sciences, enormous impact into, but that wasn't like, he did not wake up when he was 40 years old or 30 years old saying, how do I generate large impact? No, he just said, I want to understand the forces that made the Great Depression propagate in a way that left so many Americans hungry. Okay, that's fine. Then you tell that academic, go and knock yourself out. This is what you're doing. I don't care if you are a toad at the bottom of the fountain, whatever. The impact comes later, Prague. The impact comes later, right? Then when the time comes, there are the ideas, there's all this knowledge that is applied and that I can tell you saved many, many people from basically turning hungry. So I don't view it, I do worry when we say, we're going to judge you, Mr. Bernanke, for not generating impact. I think that's a mistake. That's a mistake. And that takes us away from the first and the second purpose, so to speak. And I think that would be a serious mistake that would cost Columbia in the long run. But let me stop there.
I would just add that I've been thinking this whole time, from the time Reinhold started to speak, of W.B. Du Bois, who had an academic career that is a little bit like Bernard. I mean, in the sense that there was a real academic and European influence academic career. There was always an engagement with the world. If you look at his career, you'll see that you can't separate. Well, you they may do different things at different times, but you don't really separate these purposes. And maybe this should be just the fact that we're fourth purposing for the first time in these couple of years, and that we
I
need
don't
to
think,
put these things.
I don't
back
think that
together.
neither Sam nor I were arguing that,
But
that,
the
I mean, we
language-
were arguing, at least I can speak for myself. I think what I was trying to say is, I think generation of knowledge is fundamental. I'm a researcher myself, and you are. But what I'm saying is there is probably, we need to consider a different way of how we generate knowledge that is maybe a bit more, think about including, maybe being different in terms of who we include at the table when we're even designing our research questions, right? Are there other disciplines that can enrich our own discipline? And you do that all the time, but I think that's what, it wasn't the argument, and I don't think it's Sam's argument either, is that I think the valuing of the generation of knowledge is very fundamental. And so that's why I was focusing on the how, is can we think of a way in which moving forward, we can think differently of how we generate and how we disseminate knowledge. It doesn't mean that everybody has to go out there and do what your other economics student is doing. It just means that maybe there's a different way we can consider.
Yeah, maybe I'll just respond in a couple of ways. So first of all, maybe I'm the eternal optimist here, but I don't actually see a conflict, but I do see a number of issues being raised, and maybe responding in a couple of ways. One is a little bit more sort of the inside baseball discussions that we have here, and maybe I can react to that, and then maybe go on to just sort of maybe more the broader issue is, I mean, I fully actually agree with a lot of the points here, and maybe some of this is in reaction to trying to call this one purpose, second, third, and then slicing and dicing it. I actually I think, when I heard Rosalind, but by the way, I still haven't made it through a critique of pure reason or a critique of practical reason. I'm going to have to get to more. Okay, sure. Okay, maybe I'm going to have to start with that one first. I almost,
It's
Well,
relatable.
I almost minored in philosophy, and I grew up as a scientist, actually. So I think the point, and I actually see this reflected in a lot of the students, is a lot of us are not slicing and dicing this in terms of, one or two or three or four. I heard what Rosalind said, I thought was really, actually, I think well put, was if we want to talk about the fourth purpose, that there may be an element of I think you said something like a distinct ambition, or something like, to that point, because there are, we have not always traditionally rewarded or incentivized. I think Miguel brought up some of these points as well. Our faculty or our students. I didn't mention students as much in my previous remarks, which I just didn't have enough time to talk about. Obviously, educating the students and preparing them to, is critically important. But we haven't traditionally always done that at universities. We've had faculty really try to engage with the world in one way or another, and we've sort of tolerated it, but it has not been in our reward structure. And so I think that's kind of where we're trying to add that to the mix, but hopefully in a very healthy and productive manner. And for most of us, I think, myself included, but I think a lot of the students, we're absolutely cognizant. I haven't met as a single faculty in engineering, which is where I'm from, and you might say that as very applied or fourth purpose, who doesn't appreciate the absolute criticality of basic knowledge. I mean, we have to start with that. And in fact, I totally agree. It's more important than ever, because in this day and age, we're using, we're at the risk of coming into some very monolithic thinking. We're relying on a lot of technologies, as much as I love technologies, that are becoming ubiquitous. And there's a lot of groupthink going on, and we have to train our students to think originally. And these original ideas, which might be actually just quote unquote true ideas, which is a fraught word, are harder to come by actually. And so it's absolutely critical we maintain that at a university. But as has always been the tradition, a lot of these ideas come from thinking about the issues in the world. These ideas don't come from, people just thinking in a vacuum. it's always been the case that these ideas have been, and this is why there's really kind of, in a way, there's nothing new here, right? In a way, in that, why do we need a distinct purpose? This is something that scholars have done all the time, but it's taking that next step. And but I think I just want to end off by maybe going to the, not the inside baseball, but sort of like the heart of the issue, which I'm hearing is what should be the role of a university moving forward? What is at the heart of our values, and what maybe is our competitive advantage, if you want to think about it like that? And there's multiple things that I think we need to do well. We need to, again, if you had to enumerate them, it is educating, training our students, preparing our students. I almost, it's not just educating in a unidirectional manner. We learn from our students as well, but that is important, and we have always done that. Doing basic scholarship will always be important, and then service. But then what we're saying now is engaging with these problems in a very firsthand manner, because the world and ourselves, we cannot afford for universities to be divorced from the problems and be sort of just above the fray. And so if you want to enumerate the 1, 2, 3, and 4, that's maybe a reason for doing that. But really, I think a lot of us are very fluid in in trying to pursue all those aims together.
All right. Well, we do have questions already, and so I think, first of all, I must say I neglected to thank Sophia Sumari and Beth Samaya, who made this entire operation possible. And so Sophia will have a mic, right? Will you have a mic? Oh, okay. And also, but before we just do that, just to return for like 5 seconds to the philosophy seminar, it probably is still worth bearing in mind that in those days, the days of the Humboldtian University and Kant's time as well, the grant money was in the theology department. There was a bit less available for the training of PhDs in philosophy, and so to some extent, this is the conflict that persists, or that we're talking about, but that's to be continued.
Thank you. My name is Wilson from a startup called Convergence on collective intelligence. Number one, how do you teach students systems thinking? Because we as human beings don't like complexity, uncertainty. We have biases, availability bias, confirmation bias. And interdisciplinary research is looked down in universities. So how do you teach students systems thinking, synthesizing mind, those kind of things? Because the knowledge you create today will be obsolete in 2 years with the rate of change that we see. The second question is, there's a quadruple helix model of innovation involving the independence and interdependence and synergy among universities, the government, the private sector, and nonprofits, including communities, foundations, and stuff. And how do you promote that in a global scale? And are you doing that? Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe I can start with the next one, since this is what I do every day. I do think it's how do we promote the partnerships that you mentioned, between academia and all these diverse kinds of stakeholders that probably have never sat in the same room together ever. And I do think it's it's an approach that has been at the core of what I've done, in global health now for more than 30 years. And I think it starts out by kind of bringing people together from the very beginning, to shape whatever is being determined together from the beginning, rather than kind of formulating our own ideas as academics and then going out and looking for partners and so on and so forth. So it's including, it being inclusive, bringing people to the same table from the very beginning, understanding their language, because we speak very different language, understanding their motivation, which can be very different motivation, and coming to a consensus around what we want to accomplish together, realizing that there are different motivations, different skill sets that are, very different and so on. And it has, I mean, in my experience, it's worked quite well, actually. But it has meant that it's not, I want to acknowledge that it's not easy. This is something that I think Sam touched on, because I think in many ways, it's much easier to have a plan and have a research plan or whatever it is and just go out and do it. It's faster. You can do it. You don't have to build all those coalitions. But in the end, that we've learned the hard way is that if you really want to get people to buy into what you're trying to do and hopefully adopt it and scale it up, you have to do the hard work of working very hard at building these partnerships. And it can be incredibly complex. And that's and it means sitting together and being willing to listen and being humble and changing your mind, adjusting what your preconceived ideas and so on. Yeah.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for a great discussion. I am from the Caribbean. I teach public health at a small community college, so I would probably take it a little away from Columbia University. The pandemic forced the digitization of education, and now with what I would term the globalization of digital platforms, I'm very, very concerned with the quality of education that is occurring now. I'm very concerned because I'm not sure the students are really engaging in critical thinking and how to really facilitate what I believe is really the core role of a university, is to get a populace that can actually make critical, creative, imaginary solutions to problems. Something that is bothering me a bit is the role of big tech and how they seem to have hijacked the education process. A development that is even more frightening to me now is that I believe there are apps or sites where students can actually have a paper written for them, and it may circumvent things like Turnitin and so on, the normal checks and balances. So as an educator, I'm in a quandary. So any suggestions? I know I think Sia, I touched on it a little bit, but that's my little question. Thank you.
A number of us, including all the deans, actually met today for about 5 hours to talk about this topic. And a lot of the universities are wrestling with this. And, there's no easy answer. And, we can't stop technology from happening, including from some of the big tech companies, this generative AI stuff right now coming up from two of the big companies. And so it's the challenge to try to figure out how to use it for good rather than for in a negative way. And so I think there were a couple of themes, at least maybe of thinking about how universities should think about it. One is, how should we be using these technologies or not using, or sort of like on the tail end side of it, where and giving guidance to our faculty and students on how to work with these technologies in a way that's productive, because these can be powerful tools as well, and they could actually automate a lot of the rudimentary sort of work, come up with some ideas of first drafts. But of course, there's a lot of dangers here. So we need to give some guidance and guardrails. By the way, don't put any confidential information into ChatGPT, because it will spit it back out to the next user who, so there's a lot of things like that you have to think about. But it is potentially a tool, starting with the fact that we probably can't stop it from being used, but it is a tool that could potentially unleash new creativity and also democratize certain things. Like there's people who can't, with their grammar and things like that. So that's one thing that we have to think about from a university's point of view. The other contribution is more upstream, I think, is where maybe we can help play a role, not only because we have actually some of the real experts in this specific area, but just in general in technology, but also not only from the technological side, but thinking about it with our colleagues from humanities, from the policy area, to think about what all of this ethics, what all of this means. And there's a lot of deep philosophical issues here in terms of agency and ethics and things like that, that maybe it's only really a place like a university that can provide some very unique perspectives and help guide this. And I've talked to some of these big tech companies, and they claim that they are actually very open to have social scientists and humanists, in their discussions. But so I think, both upstream and downstream, we can potentially have a role here.
I mean, just quickly, I think you also were raising the issue of I think the Zoomification of education, I call it. And I think that's kind of certainly that was very important during COVID, at the worst days of COVID, to be able to continue with virtual education. But I do have concerns, is that it's convenient, and that by going the convenient route, we're jeopardizing something very valuable in the connections between people in a classroom, interacting with each other, listening to each other in person, not multitasking on Zoom. So I think that's something that I'm very concerned about, because I see almost a temptation for people to think of the easy way out, which is to go the virtual way. And I think there's a danger of losing, as you said, very much by not appreciating the value of the instructor-student, but also the student-student interactions.
There is so much to say about this, but we've been given the signal that our time is coming to a close. But we have enough time for actually two more questions, because we have one here, and then Vishaka will have the last word. So.
Thank you. I'll be very short, and I wanted to thank you for this very interesting and much needed discussion. And I have a comment, which can be a concluding remark, perhaps, about this idea of how do you engage academia with the voices and the reality outside the walls. And in practice, how do you do that? Is inviting and also recognizing these other voices to spaces like the ones we had today. So perhaps it would have been interesting to include in the panel a community leader from Harlem, or an artist, or a journalist, and ask them as well, what is the role of academia today?
You're absolutely right. And I think it's kind of interesting, because at CWP, we always say that the convenings have to include always the voice of practitioners, not just academics, and the voice of the ultimate users, so I agree completely. And that's a principle that we always follow. Yeah.
It is time. So it's time for us to have some refreshments. But let me just say that when we thought about this panel, there were two pieces of this: reimagining global and the place of university. So we were really trying to figure out, in this reality of where the world is, what should be the place of the university. And one of the things that I think it would be useful for us to keep thinking about is, what is the condition of the world that requires that we think of creating knowledge differently? What is that how, as Wafa, you were saying? And the last question that came up, at CGT, we always say that thinking with the world is more important, or as important, than thinking about the world, meaning you are in the world. What is that relationality? And in order to understand that, what is the new form of knowledge we need? So the word that came up was systemic learning, synthetic learning, bringing different ideas together to understand the question. How do we do that? How does a university do that? At CGT, we always say that, therefore, many of our scholarly projects are actually designed with different parts of the world into this conversation, not just academics, but even non-academics, artists, and others, so that it actually not just enrich the conversation, but it changes the nature of the knowledge you create. And how do we do that? It seems to me that our issue is How do we create knowledge that actually needs to reflect where the world is going? And how do we do that? I hope that's another conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
There is an opportunity to continue the conversation right back here. So thanks again to everybody.